What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 47, and I am the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I am interviewing Connor Freeman, who's a writer at the Libertarian Institute. We have a great conversation about his recent article on Trump's foreign policy legacy. This is a subject that I've been really wanting to cover, and Connor's article takes it apart perfectly. I'll put a link to his article in the show notes page, as well as a link to his full author archive at the Libertarian Institute for people who want to check out his work. And I will also put his Twitter handle there so you can check that out. Before I get to the interview, I just want to take a second to thank the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is where you could go to get your CBD products. These are quality CBD products, not something that's thrown together and sold in gummy worms at the head shop, but rather lab tested products that come in extracts, soft gels, and all different creams, anything that you could, think of to, help yourself with some CBD, to help take away some pain, to help with some anxiety. So visit PalomaVerdeStore.com. If you know what you want, you already like CBD products, just go right in and buy it and use the promo code PEACE at checkout. A little bit new to CBD, check out their education tab and see how it could help you, what kind of different products you could take. So again, recommend PalomaVerdeStore.com. Use the promo code PEACE. You'll be supporting myself and a great libertarian, Carlos, who runs Paloma Verde. And with that, I'll get to the interview with Connor. All right, everyone, I'm here with Connor for the interview. Connor, how you doing?
Fantastic, Kyle. How about yourself?
Doing good. And so, we were talking a little bit before the show, and I had
Thank you for having
mentioned
me.
this. And one of the things I had wanted to do before the end of the year is record a show on Donald Trump's foreign policy legacy, and kind of specifically this idea that Donald Trump is either a anti-war president, the most anti-war president, or something along these lines. He's the guy who hasn't started a war. And then, of course, I check out the Libertarian Institute every day, and I saw this article titled "Nothing Delivered: Trump's Anti-War Deception." And boy, did it hit on just about everything I was thinking. And so I, shot Connor in message and said, "Hey, can we do a show?" And so we're here to talk about, well, Trump's anti-war deception. So I guess, do you give Trump any credit at all for being the anti-war president? I certainly don't think it's deserved.
No, I agree with you. I think that, as I say in the piece, I think for his own nefarious reasons, he marketed himself that way. Um, and I think he may have screwed up because by making himself sort of like the guy that this large base rallied around and really supported, he kept referring to himself in that way, and there were a lot of grifters out there kind of marketing him that way. And so I think fortunately for us, unfortunately, obviously as far as the reality goes, because it may have diluted what that term, what it even means to be anti-war and what the standards are. There's a lot of that going around, but I think the fact that he convinced so many more people on the right than there already were that they are anti-war, that they should be averse to these interventions and to, they may not describe it this way, but U.S. imperialism. I think is actually, that's probably the best thing that he's done. And obviously there have been some drawdowns and he's set some precedents for things, but unfortunately it doesn't mean anything unless he outright ends a war. Because as long as there's a presence there, then Biden is not put in a situation where he has to be the bad guy by sending troops actually back in and reinvading another country.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think those are kind of the places that you could give Trump his credit. Is that occasionally he said something anti-war, and that reaction was met by the mainstream so harshly. It did draw a lot of Trump supporters into realizing that that whole fake news campaign also includes the foreign policy stuff. And
Right.
there's a lot more people who are skeptical. I think you give him credit for that. I also saw Dan DePetris post a thread on Twitter asking people what they thought was Trump's, great foreign policy victory and worst foreign policy failure. And one of the victories that was pointed out was he drew a larger line between who were the neocons and who were the realists on foreign policy. And I think that's other thing that you could give him credit for, although I don't know how much he deserves of it. It's just his overall demeanor was so oppositional that that a lot of really terrible people opposed him, and so those people are a little bit more exposed and separated from the I guess the more sane people, and so that those would I think be the two benefits. Like you said, the drawdowns I think are relatively meaningless without actually ending the actual conflict.
Sure. And another thing too is, and it, as far as like the realists, the argument about how we've sort of, separated the realists from the neocons, I think it's a little bit more nuanced because his Trump's opposition to NATO is not it's not a Ron Paulian opposition to NATO. It doesn't really puncture the pseudo legitimacy of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is anachronistic and could cause war, and is really effectively a corporate welfare scheme with imperial designs targeted at Russia and or it's getting bogged down in Afghanistan for no good reason. It's just to make money for these military contractors and to expand the U.S. global footprint. And a lot of these other countries get in on the gravy train, but he doesn't really, especially when you have like Esper going to Mark Esper, the former defense secretary, going to the Atlantic Council earlier this year and essentially saying, basically that you need basically these countries are not paying enough is the problem, and that we are facing serious threats and new threats in the 21st century, namely Russia and China, that must be countered. And the idea is that these states are not pulling their weight. So it's not really, uh, it's not jeopardizing the overall Cold War narrative of the neocons and the imperialists. It's just basically saying that we should not be shouldering the burden so much ourselves. When in fact it's entirely up to us to even be involved like this in the first place. And what we should be advocating is uh, I would say abolish NATO, but failing that, at least the U.S. should leave NATO.
Right. No, and I guess the line would be is that there are people who want the U.S. to support jihadists against Iran and its perceived allies, and then there are people who are more realist than that who realize that's crazy, and then
Sure.
I think probably there's a line of people who want a physical kinetic war with Iran, and then people who just want like the more economic side, which is still absolutely brutal. And maybe we could now get to the rest of Trump's foreign policy, which has been absolutely awful. And starting with Iran, where I guess if somebody told me to make the case against Trump hasn't started a war, I think the best example would be Iran, where um, I'm a Ron Paulian, so Ron
Me
Paul has
too.
always said that sanctions are war. That's economic warfare, and so he certainly levied a lot of sanctions on Iran. But even on top of that, I think getting out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was such a change in the dynamics between the U.S. Iranian relationship. You could really make the case that he reunited uh, at the Cold War, the economic war with Iran. If not, we've the with the killing of Soleimani and now this nuclear scientist, somewhat of a kinetic war. So, what do you think about
Absolutely.
that? Yeah,
Well, so Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, and essentially has been escalating up to basically we're at this point where we have brinksmanship. Whether I mean the Israeli army chief just came out and said that there have been 500 Israeli airstrikes in Syria this year, and I don't know if that number is accurate, but I know that Israel has bombed Syria hundreds of times throughout the war. And I know that just in the last several months, talking about as far as the kinetic side, like you said, the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, it appears, according to the Daily Beast, in that article that came out, I think it was last month, that Trump has handed over his Iran policy in the waning days of his term to uh, Mike Pompeo, who is working with Netanyahu essentially to, I don't know necessarily to start a hot war, but it looks like that to me, it looks like that could be what's going on. I know Gareth Porter has reported on the idea that Netanyahu and Pompeo see this as a very narrow window of opportunity, a unique opportunity to get something like that done. So I think they set the tone with 2020 by killing Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Muhandis, the head of the deputy of the Popular Mobilization Forces, after Israel had been bombing Iraq toward the end of the year in 2019. And we saw major escalations where Iraq demanded to end the U.S. occupation, and Trump threatened to basically obliterate their economy by revoking their access to the oil ministry's bank account at the New York Fed, which would have decimated their economy overnight. And this is obviously because of the way Iraq War II worked out, a major ally of Iran, and would likely be the site of certainly a proxy war between the U.S. and Iran, which is one of the reasons why the Iraqis are very concerned about the tensions going on between the U.S. and Iran. And I think, as we've seen with just particularly the peace deals recently, we are arming these countries to the teeth, like the UAE and Bahrain and now Sudan and Morocco. And the whole idea is essentially, at least with the Abraham Accords with UAE and Bahrain, is to encircle Iran. And we're seeing in the actually one of the weapon in there, I guess. So after the UAE deal, there's this $8 billion compensation arms agreement with Israel, where they're getting these. I think they're like KC-48A Strato tankers and refueling aircraft that can refuel multiple warplanes at the same time. It's reminding me a little bit too much of Yemen, and I don't know. I mean, I know that if the U.S. did make a move against Iran, or if Israel did, it would largely be an air war, and that just, I mean, none of this is looking good to me.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I think that I guess the main goal of Pompeo and Netanyahu, and then also somebody who surfaced their dragon head today, Elliot Abrams, who's the U.S. Iran envoy now, which is crazy, but he actually I think endorsed the killing of the Iran nuclear scientist today or yesterday or something like that. So but what I think their main goal is to make sure that Biden can't return to the nuclear deal. Not being in the nuclear deal is, I think, a path to warfare. With as many people in the United States among the think tanks and the foreign policy establishment who believe Iran is working on a nuclear bomb, unless there's this deal in place that makes it so apparent that they're not working on a nuclear bomb that even the likes of Elliot Abrams can't lie to start a war with them. I guess that creates a situation that during the Biden years, I think we're going to have only increasing tensions with Iran. I think that's the goal, is not necessarily to start a war before we get to the end of Trump's administration, like an actual bombing of Iran, but basically to put the Biden administration on the path where they have no other choice but to continue to escalate with Iran. And yeah, and so I as much as it looks good that there are people within the Biden administration who seem genuinely concerned about the potential for war between the U.S. And Iran, and would like to get back into the nuclear deal. I don't think Biden will be willing to invest the political capital into it that he needs. That there's not enough Democrat senators who are willing to push for it. Hell, I mean, we've seen Congress vote to include the refusal to lift sanctions in the NDAA and stuff like that. And so we could actually see Congress work against peace. And I definitely don't see Biden overcoming the Congress working against peace. So I would guess that's the goal, but I definitely think putting us on the path to war. And then also, the warfare here that has just been so brutal on Iran the past year. I mean, this is a country that's apparently suffered the most or won the most from the COVID pandemic. And reading from different accounts of people, it's hard to get medicine there for things that are consistent. If people have relatives who are like on some kind of medicine that you need constantly, like diabetic insulin, if you have like for like a heart attack or a stroke, you might be on a blood thinner. Apparently, those medicines are running out, and so that's certainly a kind of warfare if you're depriving a country of the medical supplies they need.
Oh, absolutely. And the also another thing is, by the way, so well, first of all, the other thing I'm concerned about with the Biden administration is Rouhani and Zarif, the foreign minister, have made it very clear that if the U.S. lifts sanctions, they will return to full compliance with the Iran deal, with the JCPOA. But the the Biden administration and certainly people like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the Secretary of State nominee and the likely national security advisor, um, respectively, have said that essentially they want Iran to enter into follow-on negotiations that will likely have to do, because they've been talking about this for years. Anybody who wants a new deal wants it to be more restrictive with respect to Iran's foreign policy, their support for proxies in the region, and their ballistic missile program, and also to further restrict their nuclear program beyond what was already in the JCPOA. And I think, um, not that I don't know what the consequences would be if Iran refused, but I certainly wouldn't agree to that if I were them. That's their that's their whole independence. That's their deterrence. Why would they stop supporting Hezbollah? Why would they stop supporting Assad? I don't understand why they would ever even consider that. It's just I don't I guess the strategy is essentially to make them fully submit and be submerged into the empire, or else, essentially seems to be the strategy.
Yeah, I imagine that somewhere along the line, Trump was convinced by like Rudy Giuliani that the MEK could rule Iran or something like that, which is this
Right.
radical like Exodus group that's never going to rule Iran. It's a minority. It's just not going to happen. But they do pay people like Rudy Giuliani tens of thousands of
Bolton.
dollars to come speak, John Bolton to come speak at their events. And why they do that is so then when these people are in the White House with the president, they say, Mr. President, things in Iran are really bad, but there is this group that could come to power and rise and stuff like that. And so, Trump, I'm sure, was particularly susceptible to that. Biden, I don't think would count himself as a foreign policy lightweight. I'm not quite sure where his mental facilities are now. I know when he was like vice president, picked to be vice president, one of the things was is that he was going to be heavily involved in foreign policy. He was very involved in the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq, which was, not to give him credit for, it was forced by the Iraqis.
Right.
But then also, um, he was, putting a point on the Ukraine policy, which was awful. But, he was the person, and that's because he fashions himself to be something of a policy intellectual or something like that. Not that he deserves that. And so maybe he'll pay more attention. Maybe he'll have some better instincts. I mean, the Iran nuclear deal was, his bosses, and he pretty much ran on being Obama again. So maybe that would contribute to him getting back within that deal. Is there anything else on Iran? I'd like to touch on a couple other Mideast conflicts, I guess.
Sure. Well, I would just say that I would really like to see Biden return to the JCPOA, but I know that Scott Ritter has essentially said that many of the hawks in Biden's soon-to-be cabinet have been indicating that they may just go ahead and stick with the maximum pressure campaign, which I think is another bleeding into other topics we'll get into. Trump sort of, if Trump is sort of marketed as this isolationist weakling who completely fumbled all these different foreign policy moves and put us in a vulnerable position, which I don't see it that way. I see it as a more aggressive. Well, we're closer to war on several fronts, but it's not. I mean, the mainstream view that Trump has sort of given away the store to Russia or to China or to whoever. Even Kim Jong Un, laughably, as they try to pull that kind of crap in the media. Um, I don't know if Biden will be able to withstand, or rather, it'll be very easy for the Hawks to just sort of escalate things on the basis that, you know, what Trump did. You're not going to go as far as Trump. You're going to be a dove compared to Trump, who was, like I said, this feckless Russian puppet.
Yeah. No, certainly not only like the Russia thing. There are some people who like, float, oh, Ivanka's ties to China, so he's owned by China. Or just like the narrative you see about Joe Biden, where America's going to take charge of the world again, like somehow Donald Trump uh,
Yeah,
did something to particularly remove the American position as world hegemon. Where, if anything, that was Obama getting involved in like Syria or kind of proved that wasn't true. The Bush squandering in Iraq and everything. But he hasn't withdrawn from the world. He's pressured NATO to pay more for defense, but
yeah,
that's that's about it. I
yeah.
mean, maybe
And
just
it's almost a pro NATO argument. It's saying it's a good cause. You should be paying more. You should be aggressive with us. And Esper was at the Atlantic Council I was referring to earlier. He was saying, you've got to be ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with us when we confront Russia and China. I mean, that's a very, it's almost a direct quote. It's a paraphrase, though, but it's almost exactly what he says.
so. One of the things that Donald Trump said running for president was Hillary Clinton wanted to get us into wars and he wanted to get us out of war. And so people will point to Afghanistan as a victory for Donald Trump's foreign policy, I think, and say that, hey, we had 4,500 going in, he's got 2,500 coming out. Look, he de escalated in Afghanistan. But, if you read the Cost of War project from University, it looks like he ramped up that war quite a bit.
Civilian casualties are up 330%, I believe, was the article that just came out at antiwar.com from the Cost of War Project report. And I think those numbers are low estimates, likely. I'm sure you'd agree. So you can only extrapolate or hypothesize as to how bad it's been. But he doubled the troop deployment there once he came in. They say he got rolled by the Pentagon. I mean, who knows exactly what went down? But really, what's important for our purposes is he escalated the war from where it was, loosened the rules of engagement as he did elsewhere, like Yemen and Somalia, and he set records for the number of bombs dropped in the country. About 15,000 bombs were dropped on Afghanistan between 2018 and 2019. The best thing that Trump has done is somehow he got Zalmay Khalilzad to pursue the deal with the Taliban, which should have it looked like we were on track to ending the war. Even the Taliban, I've seen reports after things started to get a little less rocky at the Doha talks, they said that they were encouraged and that they thought that Biden would go along with the plan to end the occupation, to end the war. I haven't seen any indications from Biden that that's the case, and I think the fact that, especially after all this projection, well, this sort of everybody was expecting that something big was going to happen after he got Doug McGregor in there as his senior advisor to Christopher Miller after they fired Esper. We all thought, well, not we, but certainly a lot of people were theorizing that this could spell, Trump really coming in there and doing the right thing and just ending the war. And one of the crux of the first part of the piece that I wrote is about how he was already scheduled to have 2,500 troops in the country by early January. So he eventually came out and said that he would reduce troops to 2,500 in both Iraq and Afghanistan. There are 3,000 soldiers in Iraq now. So all he's doing is taking 500 troops out of Iraq and leaving 2,500 in Afghanistan, where Biden will no doubt at least maintain that troop level, that presence there, but he'll likely escalate it. So it's completely useless almost.
Yeah,
And it's a shame because the deal was really an anomaly and something that, yeah, if he had gone through with that, then I think I would have had to have eaten my words, but he hasn't.
right. Yeah, that was like I thought the biggest problem with the deal when it was negotiated was that the troops wouldn't fully come out until Donald Trump's what would have been second term, and so setting it up for whoever was the Dem. And all along, whenever Donald Trump said I want to get out of Afghanistan, the Democrats can't climb over each other fast enough to say it's too soon. Not which makes no sense. This is the longest war in American history.
Yep.
They're saying it's too soon to end it. Of
No,
course, these are
it's
people
disgusting.
that, right, like, they would probably mod somebody who was supporting the Vietnam War, 5 or 6 years in, saying, like, what was this fool doing here? They are 19 years into Afghanistan, saying that if we leave, it's the most dangerous thing that can happen. That is Liz Cheney and Dan Crenshaw, who are, the neocon leading Republicans, but it's also Tammy Duckworth, who's billed as a somewhat progressive Democrat. So
Oh
these,
yeah.
these, I, I guess you can't give Trump really credit for drawing down in Afghanistan unless he got everybody out. He
Hmm.
got everybody out, and I think it's harder for Biden to go back in. But if you leave some people in, then you could do whatever. Like this is what happened in Syria. Once Obama put troops in Syria, he said, "Oh, originally you're only supposed to have a couple hundred troops there, or something like a couple dozen troops, maybe." But he went and put as many as he wanted there. Once they're there, they're there. And whether the president knows about it or not, I mean, his envoy to Syria after he quit, who was that? James Jeffrey?
James Jeffrey.
Yeah, came out and said, "Yeah, I lied about the number of troops." So you leave troops in the country, you're
Oh, that
not
was
ending
crazy.
the war. You even if you have a timetable for withdrawal, you can't. I think he put Biden in the perfect position for Afghanistan. Because I think Biden got what he wanted, basically an air war with a few a few hundred, few thousand troops, like
Yeah.
it, on his way out the door,
It's
because
how he
Trump's
likes to do it. Those counterterrorism JSOC wars.
right.
Just yeah, like well, very similar to what goes on in Somalia too. It's just as long as we're bombing this country, that's we're doing our part as the global policeman, as the savior of the world. And it's ironic too because if the Democrats are so anti-Russia, it's a 20-year war fighting on the side of Russia's allies. And if the Republicans are so against Iran, why are we fighting a 20-year war, spending $2 trillion fighting for their allies, the Hazaras in the Northern Alliance? It makes no sense. But it doesn't matter because the whole point of all this propaganda is unfortunately that most Americans, because of American exceptionalism, because of the lack of any legitimate threat, and I think instinctively people know that at the end of the day, I think for a lot of people, um, I don't know about the boomers necessarily, but a lot of people, I think all this Russia hysteria, it's like a horror movie or something. It's just something, it's something to watch. It's like kind of, because how could you really be afraid? Well, what do you think? You think we're going to get attacked by Moscow? Or do these people think that we're going to get into if that Beijing wants to? Mark Milley is saying that the Beijing wants to reshape the world in China's image. Like that sounds really familiar. They're just projecting, and so I think with the problem is that people, they don't know anything about foreign policy because they're not threatened, so they just go with the flow, even if it means perpetually staying engaged in Afghanistan on the sides of the two of the worst boogeymen in the American zeitgeist, Russia and Iran.
But on top of everything else, when it comes to his Afghan policy, the Pentagon has now said they've carried out drone strikes in support of the Taliban and the Islamic State there. So that's kind of a crazy level. have going on. The other thing, you've had in Afghanistan is like kind of a new kind of war with the drug war they're waging there, where it's more towards civilian targets. Is not necessarily blowing up Taliban on the battlefield, but rather it's just dropping bombs on any tin shed that has some poppy processing facility in it.
using B-52s often.
Right,
It's just absolutely ludicrous.
it is.
And I don't know. It's tens of thousands of civilians who have been killed in this, and it's just an absolute, at least, right? And it's just a complete shame. And I don't know. I don't know if we have to just keep telling the American people how many people have been killed in these wars to get them to care, or maybe I wouldn't do this, but hypothetically, like I was alluding to earlier, shouldn't it kind of blow their minds that they're on the side of Russia and Iran, or of communist child molesters and warlords in Afghanistan for 20 years? It doesn't seem to. I guess they don't know, but the Taliban doesn't know who we are, which is a real weird sort of mirroring of all of that. They think, many of them, or not the Taliban specifically, but many Pashtuns think that we're just communists, essentially, left over from the Soviet war.
Right.
Um, it's just complete chaos, but it makes a lot of money for the worst people in our society.
I mean, there's anecdote after anecdote, especially from the start of the war or during the surge with the U.S. occupation. They're going into places they haven't gone before. People there don't even know about 9/11 or any of that. That's completely
Hmm.
irrelevant to them. But let's not get too bogged down in Afghanistan like the U.S. empire. I want to shift over to touch on one more Mideast conflict or relative Mideast conflict that I think Trump has really ramped up, and that was Somalia.
Hmm.
There, you have, I believe, in just a single year, Donald Trump carrying out more airstrikes than in the uh, Obama and Bush years combined. So that's
Yep.
quite a lot of action. He's added a couple hundred troops. He's changed the designation of Somalia to area of active hostilities. That's loosened the restrictions there. On top of all of that, maybe the craziest part to me, his initial instinct was to get out of Somalia and had be talked out of it by James Mattis, who said, "I'll blame
Right.
you for anything bad that happens in Somalia after you leave." But just, they have this president who thought a war was a bad idea and ended up multiplying it by multiple, 10 times or so.
Yeah. Mattis said to him, he started threatening him that, well, there's going to be a Times Square bombing if you try to take the troops out of Somalia. Because Trump allegedly, according, I think it's the Washington Post, that piece was allegedly saying to Mattis, like, why the hell are we in there in the first place? Which is a perfectly reasonable question to ask. And Mattis said to him, well, we're there to prevent a Times Square bombing, which is, it's so ridiculous because that was a thwarted terrorist attack from a well-to-do Pakistani American who had witnessed the 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 reality of the American drone war in Pakistan against the Tariqi Taliban that had killed tens of thousands of civilians. And so, if you want to prevent something like that happening, then obviously the only choice would be to pull your troops out and end the drone war. But instead, Mattis literally told President Trump, "You have no choice," which it would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall there to see all that happen. But yeah, no, he dropped 63 bombs, or that we know of, in Somalia in 2019, the most in a single year. And like I said, more airstrikes in the first 7 months of 2020 than Bush and Obama combined. Air Wars, I believe, says that the civilian casualties, I mean, AFRICOM notoriously undercounts, but they say that the reality is something like 6,800% what the official figures show. And it's like, yeah, just hundreds of that likely hundreds of civilians at minimum every year.
When it comes to Trump's foreign policy, everybody's like, usually
Oh,
one side is kind of, go ahead.
I should just say with Somalia, Trump he basically, as far as all that goes, he's saying he's going to remove the troops from there, but it's entirely just a cynical ploy because he's got thousands of troops already in Djibouti, and in Djibouti and Kenya, where largely these troops will be relocated, which neighbors Somalia. That's where the air war is based, and so it's really it's almost like he's escalated the amount of strikes and then just sort of moved around the troops he put there in the first place, and yet he's got a bunch of people out there pretending like this is a big deal and that he's really kind of ending a war, and isn't this just great? And it's like, no, it's just on its face a lie.
Well, and maybe to just add to that real quick is when it comes to Kenya, that's a place where U.S. troops have been shown to be vulnerable in the past couple of years, and so not necessarily making them safer. I think the base in Japan is probably pretty secure, but apparently the bases in Kenya aren't. But I did want to move on and to touch on Russia, where, as I was saying, I think both sides are complete. Like, right, will be like Trump's the most anti-war president, and some, he's been agreeable or able to work with Russia and it has had okay Russia policy, and then the left will complain or say that Trump's been a complete capitulation to Russia and he's Putin's puppet. And a lot of people still believe this that it completely pushed over the Putin's whims and policies during these past 4 years, and yet from my perspective he's been horrible and super aggressive when it comes to Russia. The sanctions, the getting rid of treaties, the land-based cruise missiles, all this kind of stuff. So, what do you think? I don't know if you would say he started a war, but he definitely turned up the burner on the Cold War a couple of notches.
Totally. He has ramped up the naval presence in the Black Sea, expanded NATO. He's got in the second, oh, it was in February of 2017, he was sending Abrams tanks and U.S. troops to participate in a NATO drill called Atlantic Resolve. He's put troops in Poland, sold them Patriot missiles. Even the troop, we can get into Ukraine, but even the troop withdrawals from Germany is another cynical propaganda tactic, because that's not a withdrawal. Slightly more than half of them are supposedly coming home, but about more than 5,000, I believe, are being redeployed eastward to Poland and the Baltic states. And that's one of the things that Esper was talking about at the Atlantic Council, like that it's basically saying we're going to put more pressure on Russia and China. And we're going to keep expanding it. So it's not. Again, he's escalating these new Cold War fronts and then being described as like literally a puppet of Putin. And I don't know like where we go from there, because he's arming Nazis essentially, or a government that has Nazis in its coalition, with anti-tank missiles, and patting himself on the back for it, saying that Obama sent them pillows, I sent them missiles. And what's ironic too is it seems like in our climate, well, first of all, just arming Nazis in a proxy war that's killed more than 10,000 people, and the whole coup d'etat and the Maidan revolution, there's a major escalation against Russia. It's right on their doorstep. And something I think if the American people were more aware of, they would be really outraged. But if we're in a weird situation where Biden was brought in to tie that up, as I think Victoria Nuland said, and he gets his son this cushy job in Ukraine. And so he's effectively collaborating with this coup Nazi government, and Trump is arming them. So they can't call each other out on it. But if you were to have somebody in there, a legitimate candidate, you could say, look, both of these guys are supporting Nazis, real Nazis.
Right? Yeah. Well, certainly it's for people who aren't familiar, the Azov Battalion is a group of neo-Nazi. They worship like the Stefan Bandera type. And yeah, they're a powerful faction within Ukraine. Mats Blumenthal has done a lot of good work on this figure, Andre Peruti, who I don't know if he was the head or like the second head of the
Svoboda
Ukrainian.
party, or
Yeah, it was, but he was like a high-ranking member of the Ukrainian like parliament or legislator, like in that role. He was, a far right Nazi type figure, fascist figure. and these people have now like bled into the National Guard forces of Ukraine. And so we're arming Ukraine. We're arming those guys too, or certainly the side that those guys are fighting on. And like we've seen how that turned out in Syria, where maybe you don't arm the most extreme elements, but guess who usually ends up with the arms? Or the
Oh
U.S.
yeah.
kind of, then it was just like a finger to the Russians or something like that. Saying that we could unleash these weapons against you if we decide to, or something like that. Sounds really scary, a conflict in Ukraine where American weapons fired by people who, probably had training from Americans about 100 yards the other way, killing Russians, or, Russian supplied, equipment with people who support Russia inside is a very quick recipe for, a serious escalation. Now, a very interesting part of this whole story is that Obama didn't want to arm these guys because he saw the problems within their ranks. Yeah, Trump did, but then he decided, maybe that's not a good idea, and try to, I guess he figures we're giving Ukraine a few $1 million worth of weapons, get some leverage out of it. And for that, he was impeached. And a lot of the witnesses at the impeachment trial came out right out and said that, the president shouldn't be changing the American foreign policy of getting
Right.
Ukraine these weapons. And so maybe this is, I guess, the one dynamic of the Trump administration that makes the people who are, say, well, Trump is the most anti-war president, feel like they have some justification. As even when he like tried to make a good decision, the media freaked out, or if he made a bad decision from our perspective, that was the only time he got applause, like Brian Williams saying, the beautiful U.S. weapons, and Trump became president, and Ira Van Jones
Right.
says something like that after Trump bombed Syria, fake chemical weapons, uh, fully made up claim. So, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
they red baited the whole country as a Christmas present last year. That was the whole month of December and early January. They were just talking about how Trump isn't sending weapons to Ukraine fast enough, and how dare he? We have to fight the Russians over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. And like I said, it's just I think the key to that, as far as the strategic move for the anti-war movement, is to expose how bad those factions are that we're arming. And it's all part of the new Cold War paradigm that has to really be opposed. But specifically, I mean, that's just so egregious. Practically the whole Congress lined up behind that. I mean, and if they did defend Trump, it was based in partisan politics. It had nothing to do with opposing the new Cold War. It's usually them just saying like, even if it's, I mean, a lot of the sort of one of the big problems with opposition to Russiagate from sort of the Republican side was it was more about defending Trump as opposed to debunking the narratives and opposing, like I said, this new Cold War. It was more or less just saying Trump is blameless here. He's not colluding with Putin, whatever Putin is doing to us. And it leaves a lot of openings, unfortunately.
so I want to move on to the other part of the great power competition, and that is China, where Trump has openly admitted to starting a trade war with China, but he's also really increased military tensions in the region through a few different actions, whether it was the protest movements in Hong Kong, which had some American funding, selling weapons to Taiwan, making different pledges and commitments to India, Australia, Japan, the Philippines, offering closer ties with Malaysia, Indonesia, uh, stuff like this. It's kind of, I guess, hard to say that Trump started a war because we haven't sunk any Chinese ships, or there hasn't been like any actual clash. There are some sanctions in place, but China is a large enough economy where I don't think they're as substantial as they are, say, against Iran or Venezuela, Cuba, Nigeria. And the list of countries that Trump has sanctioned is massive. It's really
Mm-hmm.
insane, so that we could do a whole show on that. But to focus on China here before we wrap, yeah, I mean, again, you can't maybe say that he started a war, but he really started something new there.
Yeah, we've since the beginning of the year, they've used the cover of the whole COVID crisis to really escalate and ramp up Obama's Asia pivot, and it's all based around essentially when I guess, well, in 2018 anyway. I think Esper had a lot to do with this, although he came in 2019. But in 2018, the national defense strategy was shifted from focusing on counterterrorism operations in North Africa and the Middle East to great power competition with China and Russia. Nobody voted on it or anything like that. The American people have no choice, but that's what we're doing now. And so we've seen flyovers of Taiwan. We've seen carrier groups sailing in the South China Sea. We've seen warships sailing through the Taiwan Strait. Uh, just incredible escalations against China, and it's almost hard to keep track of. We've had, for instance, we had just last month we had the B-1B Lancer bombers flying through the air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. And I think Biden is likely to escalate that because when Beijing first declared their air defense identification zone, the Obama administration refused to recognize it and flew B-52 bombers through it. And Biden again was very prideful of that. So I think they're just going to carry on with the escalations, and we're seeing they're trying to build up some sort of Pompeo has been largely involved in this, trying to build up an East Asian NATO called the Quad with Australia, Japan, and South Korea,
Yeah.
and or rather is Australia, yeah, India, Australia, and Japan. And it's just I don't I mean I it's we're seeing the Malamar military exercises. There's constant military exercises going on, and provoking China by sending spy planes right up to their coast, and dozens of them every month. And the South China Sea probing initiative is keeping track of it, and you can read about it at antiwar.com. It's almost every day there's some new escalation with China.
It's certain. Davey Camp has been doing great work on that, and I've had him on the show,
Absolutely.
I think twice now to talk about. We talked about my old show a few times, twice at least on conflicts of interest to talk about this, because for as good as it has been that Trump has made some of the right more anti-war, a lot of the way that these people have become more anti-war isn't necessarily that they're anti-war; they're just anti-stupid wars, and we're in a lot of stupid
Right.
wars, and so they're opposed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Libya, Pakistan, whatever else. And so that's great. Like applaud. And some of them are even like good on Ukraine and not wanting tensions with Russia and not seeing a big, point in NATO. But when it comes to China,
Yeah.
oh boy, that's a different story. And so for all that he's done to maybe shift some people's perspectives on other conflicts, he's made people worse on China and has really stirred up and drummed up the China fears. Now, as you point out, the problem is that Joe Biden's like, this guy's too soft on China. And it's like
Right.
the most boomer conversation you could ever think of is two old people who hate China yelling at each other about who hates China more. That's essentially what we have for a 2020 campaign.
And with the NDAA, he's coming out and saying again, it's like his opposition to it is that it's the biggest winner is China. And so Senator Jack Reed, who's like the ranking Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, came out and said, "We've got resolutions in here that are more hawkish on China than anything you've ever done," which is, first of all, I don't even know if he knows exactly all the escalations that have been going on over in China's neighborhood in the South China Sea, in particular, as far as the Navy goes and the Air Force. But like, what? I mean, they're trying to. But now he's got Congress trying to outhawk him on China, and his base says, I've heard people say that China owns Biden, so we might be in. The Hunter Biden thing is another rabbit hole, but it could be used it could be just another P tape sort of a thing, even if there's more evidence of it, and the P tape is obviously not a legit thing, but it could be used for the same purpose.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly, a concern with the China stuff is that it could be morphed into a little bit of a like right wing Russia Gate thing.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, Go ahead, wrap up anything else you have to say, but if not, tell people where they can find your work, where to follow you, all that kind of stuff.
Sure, sure. Well, I would just say, basically, let's keep fighting the fight and get these people to be anti-war, to actually come through on what they say, and bug the hell out of their congressmen and their senators, and force some resolutions to end these wars. And also, as things are starting to heat up with the libertarian movement going forward in the next 4 years, some very exciting things happening. We should really focus on attacking the new Cold War paradigm. And we could really, libertarians own the anti-war movement from that perspective. I mean, because Bernie Sanders is essentially a hawk, and he's been the face of the political left, not the real left that you and I like, but the sort of in the colloquial sense. And he sucks. So we can totally take that over. We have the best foreign policy of any group on the political spectrum, and we should make the most of that. My Most of my writing you can find at the Libertarian Institute. I'm writing more regularly there now than I ever have. I'm really glad to be doing that, working with you and Scott Horton. And you can find me on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96.
All right. And I'll put links to that stuff in Connor's article in the show notes page for people to easily find it. Of course, if you listen to the show, you're probably aware of the Libertarian Institute because, I write stuff there and post the podcast there every day. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks for being back on the show, and I'll have you on again soon.
Thank you, Kyle. I really appreciate it.